Max, are you melting as much as I am?
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty clammy here, but I think we'll get through it.
We were just laughing beforehand that I have broken my golden rule of caffeine curfew because I found myself getting beaten by the heat and nodding off at my desk earlier. But enough complaining from me. Very British thing to do. And there'll be a lot of very British things that we'll discuss today because I think there's some real characteristics that we hold close to our chest as British men, especially. But I'm gonna dive straight in and ask the question of what does masculinity mean to you in the modern world?
It's a whopper, isn't it? As an opening. I mean, for me, masculinity in the modern world is about being able to choose about how you should behave and having had a process where you've reflected and you've opted into however you want to be and however you want to behave. I think what's changed is that there used to be a lot of rules that guys would inherit and we wouldn't question. And now, masculinity, there's a lot more scope for us to debate things and actually choose them. So that's what it means to me. But I do think there is still a lot of pressures. And I do find myself unreflectively falling back into performing a masculinity that which maybe I've kind of absorbed from cultural forces, family, friends, that is sometimes unhealthy. So I haven't cracked it, but that's my gut reaction to that question.
I'm very similar. I feel it's much more rooted in individual value systems than it has been previously. And I think the thing I constantly reflect on is where my perception of masculinity came from that was inherited because there was nothing in the parenting I received that told me to be a certain way, but there was a definition that I felt I had to uphold when I was 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 that became very damaging for me. So, in your research and real focus on this topic, where do you think we have inherited these traits and characteristics from, especially here in the UK?
So I think we get it from how we're brought up. So parents, school, and our peer group. Now, no one is doing this consciously or deliberately. There are some bad eggs out there, some unreconstructed old-fashioned folks, and and that definitely happens. But generally, it's we role model behaviors we see, and we form ideas of what it is to be a man very subtly. So, as an example, spoke to psychologists about this, and they said, look how we treat, for example, there's a 5-year-old girl, a 5-year-old boy, and they fall over in a shop. The girl bursts into tears, and someone comes over and they'll go, "Oh, are you okay? It's going to be all right. That's it. Get it out. I'm very sorry that happened." Same thing with the boy. They go up to the boy and say, "You gonna be a brave boy? Brave boys don't cry. Come on, pull yourself together. It's fine. Let's go." Right? That if you saw that, you wouldn't think twice about it. But actually, implicit in a lot of those messages are, you know, don't show emotion. Get on with it. You are not as deserving of care as a female, for example. Now, we can get very dramatic about this stuff, but that's just an example of how these things can happen really subtly. And I think something that definitely happens, and I went to an all boys school, Fergus, so it was
So,
just
so did
boys.
I, for
Yeah,
reference, for my final 4 years, I was the
yeah.
same.
And it was a pretty competitive environment, and we're at each other, and it kind of fermented a certain form of masculinity. It was very aggressive, very competitive. If you showed any weakness, you were jumped on. Some of it was quite fun because of that. But some of it, when I reflect back, you learn survival tactics that you're not even aware you've fallen into. And then as I've got a bit older, I've gone, oh yeah, those weird habits I've inherited are not actually that useful for me now as an older man, for example, forming relationships with women, trying to have a healthy relationship with my parents, my siblings, and and friends.
It's fascinating that you say that because I reflect on my latter years at school, and I was very fortunate in the sense that the friendship group I found myself in were almost toxically hardworking, and it became cool in my year group to be looking after yourself in the gym, eating well, using moisturizer, working very hard to get the best grades you possibly could. And we kind of accidentally found ourselves in this microcosm of what podcasting would become 5 years from then. And that really sent me off in a direction where I felt like I was prepared to take on the world because I'd kind of gone through an early stage self-development journey. But amidst all that was a layer of competitiveness, a layer of aggression, a layer of who can be the best amongst us without it being spoken, but without it being in any way bitter or openly competitive. There was no malice in it. But then when I entered the rest of the world and I kind of exited that real close environment, I felt like the world was too slow, and I felt like I was failing because I couldn't maintain what I thought was the best version of myself. And I think that's what I've reflected on over time as the source of where my misaligned sense of masculinity came from, because I was placed into an environment where it allowed me to almost petri dish myself to a point where I forget about the sort of grey area of life. So coming out the other side, I often think about that, and I often think about how could I have changed things, how could I have done things differently. Obviously, I wouldn't change a thing if I had the choice, because I'm sitting here as I am today. But it's the traits that come with it that have molded who I am, my work ethic, the way I form relationships, and the way that I reflect on things, that's made me really think about why, as men, we are so lonely. Because I know that the reason that you've tackled this question is specific to a certain scenario, isn't it? And there's a few scenarios recently where I've found myself asking similar questions. So just for context, for those listening, do you want to talk us through the scenario that really set you on the journey of exploring this? And then I'll unpack a few of the ones I've been dealing with myself recently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can talk to what you just mentioned there as well, and we might come on to that later. So this the kind of situation that got me into this quest to kind of understand men and their friendship problem was kind of a personal crisis. I was planning on proposing to my girlfriend, Naomi, and I went as far as buying a ring, and took a couple of female pals along to do that. It's going to help me out. And then we went to the pub afterwards, had the ring in the little box in my pocket, and they said, right, so this is happening. Who are you going to have as your best man? And my mind sort of went blank. I thought, couldn't think of anyone in the moment. I just thought, I've had a beer, maybe that's it. So I get home and I sort of get a pad out and a pen and like, well, who are the candidates for this job? And it takes me ages to come up with 10 names. And I look down the list, and about half of them I work with, and I think they'd find it a bit odd if I asked them. It's kind of a bit too much. And the rest of these guys, some of them I hadn't seen for 2-3 years. And I just thought, where have all my male friends gone? And when I looked into it, this is a really well-established thing. We're not talking about it, or we haven't been talking about it, maybe a bit more recently, since the early 70s, when they started measuring social networks and things. Men have had less friends, especially less close friends, than women. And it gets worse as you get older. So as a kind of a fun bit of context, if you look at people's social lives, and they've studied this with phone data and all sorts, we know that people's social world thrives and is at its most kind of plump and its biggest in your late teens, early 20s. Kind of makes sense. And as you get older, it shrinks for everyone. But it shrinks a lot worse for men than it does for women. So you'll find that men in their 20s have a bigger social group than women. We get into our 40s, it's flipped on its head. And this gets worse and worse as guys get older. So there is a friendship problem. So I just thought, well, why does that happen and how can we solve it?
And you wrestled with that crisis, didn't you? You really did. And actually, there's something, I can't remember where I heard you say it, but it's something that forced me to think about how I approach discussions, which is you're still a bit reserved about hugging other men, aren't you? Even now, even as an expert. And I don't mean that as a criticism, as an arrow I've just fired at you, but it goes back to what you said earlier about that sort of inherent, there's always something hardwired in the back of your mind that you revert to.
Yeah.
And whether it is that sort of dynamic that I explained where show no weakness to your friends at 16, 17, 18 years old that might think, he's embracing that hug a bit long. It's a bit odd. Whatever it is, we do have these things that are difficult to rewire, don't we?
Yeah, like old habits die hard. And also, I think this is kind of a big theme, I think, around men and friendships with one another, is that the scripts of close relationships for men are almost all romantic. So when you do something that looks like intimacy, almost inevitably your mind goes, is this... It's not as direct as going, is this gay? but there is kind of this internal reticence a little bit where you are more reluctant than, for example, no problem hugging female friends. And I think this is a big thing I've learned about masculinity, is we code switch as guys all the time. So if you see a guy who's like hard, and then a kid comes along, they can suddenly switch into a version of themselves, and you're like, that's a different person. Or when they're with their female friends, they're like completely different, and that was certainly true of me. So I think masculinity, what is it? It's something I think that exists between us rather than in us. Like we get around men, and there's something in the charge, and we change our behaviors. We code switch into a version of ourselves. I noticed I was on a stag do at the weekend. I'm like, I get to the airport, chest is out, I get louder, my banter gets a bit spicier. I was like, what's happened to me? I've just suddenly got around other men. Okay. So we recognize that in ourselves. And I think something I've got better at is realizing when I'm getting into that mode and understanding that that's fine in some contexts, but in other contexts and for other outcomes, like building a close friendship, you're going to have different routes into connecting with people.
So I'm very fascinated to hear what you've learned from essentially a more academic approach to tackling this problem than I've really undergone in the past couple of years, because essentially the crux of the question from a personal point of view, and for those listening now that might think, I feel like I may be losing touch with my male friends, the best man I had in my head is actually someone I've not really spoken to in 2 years, or maybe not even seen in 2 or 3 years, which is something I've kind of wrestled with a bit recently personally. But what have you learned along the way that we can actually act upon to tackle this crisis? Because it is a crisis. This crisis ultimately put me in a position where I was so paralyzed by fear at exposing the way that I felt, which was progressive depression over a period of almost 2 years, that I attempted suicide over choosing to talk to my friends or family who were available and I had access to. I was very fortunate that there was a support network in place, but my perception of masculinity and who I was as a person and the pedestal I put myself on meant that I was unwilling to even acknowledge to myself the way that I felt, because of I wouldn't even, loneliness is bad for men, was my perception. If you are lonely, you have failed, and therefore if you reveal that you are lonely, people will deem you a failure. When in reality, we perpetuate loneliness in men through this cycle that you've explored. So at a base level, how can we do better as men, supporting one another, supporting ourselves when it comes to maintaining friendships and getting the best out of ourselves in a social setting?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's loads of stuff to explore here. There are basically 3 main causes of male loneliness, or male maybe friendlessness or friendlightedness, if you don't want to use loneliness, if that's too intense for some people. One's around masculinity, and I'll speak to that in a moment. One's around actually what's in us, like what our biology, and some really interesting stuff there. And the third thing, which I think is undersold in conversations around this, is actually there's been some big cultural changes that exacerbate the other thing. So let me start with masculinity. We've talked a lot on this podcast already today, and I know a lot of your audience, they're go-getters, they're high performers, they want to do well in everything they do. And that's great. But often, I think, and this was true of myself, is how do men define themselves? So psychologists have studied this, so they call it self-construal. So what a self-construal is, I ask someone, tell me about yourself. So how do they describe themselves? Or they'll say, bring in some photos that kind of show me who you are. And they've done this with men and women. Men tend to bring in photos of them doing stuff like achieving things. They'll go, well, I run my 10K, I like CrossFit, I run a startup. I'm married, by the way, and that will come later on. It's very much like they call it an independent self-construal. So our identity, our work, achievement tends to dominate our identity, whereas women, they have an interdependent self-construal. They'll explain themselves in connection to other people. Now, this identity affects what we invest in. So fundamentally, I was struggling with friendships because I'd stopped showing up. I'd stopped caring about them because I saw them as an indulgence. I saw them as something that was taking time away from other things. If I was going to a party or going out to have a Nando's with a mate, that could have been 3 hours I was spending doing something else to try and pursue a goal, if you like. And you can't cheat that. So the number one thing that limits friendships is time. You have to invest time in them. It's not a myth. There is a trade-off. And sometimes you might choose to make that trade-off. You might go, do you know what? I'm really going to try, for example, and compete in the CrossFit Games in 2 years. I've got to go hard at that. Everything else is going to fall off, but I'm happy with that decision. That's fine. But what I think men often do is they're not aware of that trade-off. And eventually it compounds and we get older and we get disconnected and we go, I regret that choice, or I'm not aware of the consequences of some of these early decisions. So I'll throw over to you in a moment, but 3 things that really bring this to life for me. If you look at when men get divorced, men get bereaved, so their partner dies, or they retire, that is when men suffer worse mental and physical health outcomes than women because they're more disconnected. So when your life is going well, you've got to invest because this shit compounds, and it's the pinch points of life. And you've had your own mental health crisis, as I know you've spoken a lot about. These pinch points is when you realise that you really need that social network.
So it's being blindsided, effectively, isn't it? If you're complacent in the good, when the bad comes along, it punches you in the face harder than it would do were you less complacent when it was good. Yeah. And I think that's definitely a trap that I've fallen into, where I view time as a currency that's exceptionally valuable, and I look at it far too methodically because I view things in the exact same way that you have. And I'm at the point now where I'm going to social events and not drinking, which means I'm leaving several hours earlier than other people are. And that's good for me in many ways, but it does make me feel a bit disconnected from... It sometimes makes me feel a bit disconnected and actually question my decision. And I don't want to be overly dogmatic about it, but the reason I'm not doing that is because I've factored in time the following day that I need to be up and cognitive to be able to doing things that are moving me forwards with the businesses, with training, etc., etc. So I am aware of the issue, but I still act against the reality of the situation. And I'm actually taking steps to try and integrate more of the connectivity into the things that I do on a day-to-day basis. So it's kind of habit stacking. It's James Clear 101, which is, rather than going for my long bike rides on my own for 5 hours on the Saturday, I'm condensing it to 3 hours with people that I can enjoy spending time with, because whilst the training stimulus might be a little bit reduced, I can make that up elsewhere, I'm getting more from it whilst achieving the same end in the same time frame.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm finding to be the most effective thing to sort of tackle, not a crisis, but a period of reflection I'm coming out the back of, where from that masculinity point of view, that first point, before we sort of discuss the biology and then the compounding factors in society,
yeah,
that's been really, really valuable for me.
So, that's great. I think one thing I would say is that I think using some of this language and this mindset around productivity and management and applying it to this subject is useful, I think, 'cause it's for men will often see friendships or relationships as a bit feminine or a bit woo-woo, but actually, if you're a leader, you can show leadership in this. So one of the biggest things I learned was, rather than outsource my social world to my girlfriend or my female friends, I'm going to own that, and I'm going to lead it. And socializing is very contingent on leadership. Someone needs to initiate it. There's an igniter, right? And blokes tend not to do that. So I know a guy called Steve. I've featured this in the book because I just think it's probably just such a brilliant little tip and a little simple metaphor. He's got loads of friends. I said, Steve, how come you've got so many male friends? He says, well, my friends call me the Sherpa, right? Like those Nepalese soldiers that carry everything up the mountain. They call me the Sherpa because I organise everything. But if I didn't organise everything, we'd never see each other. And I thought, that is a great little metaphor. Be the Sherpa in your social life. Be the one who sends the text, organises the meetup. So this kind of mindset approach, this energy, we can harness it. One thing I would say, though, as a bit of a pushback, is I think efficiency and convenience can rub up against the social world. Because imagine being on the other side of that. People know when they're being scheduled. And if you think about it, intimacy doesn't work on a clock, right? We're talking today for about an hour, and we're now getting into some stuff. But if you said, Max, I want to do this podcast, it's 10 minutes, I just want your top tips, then I'm out. We're not going to get into the kind of, the marrow of what we're doing here. So I would be a bit wary of trying to over schedule and over kind of be overly productive with this stuff. But I do think, like you say, it's great that that habit stacking things, a nice way of thinking of it.
I agree, actually. And I think it's important to flag that from my own bias, that is essentially coming out the back of a period where I have, due to trying to be so efficient, essentially forcefully and accidentally isolated myself in my own training because the volume has been so high. So in depriving myself of that, I've actually found a real good way to just bring myself back that little bit more is by making training more sociable in my own circumstances. So it's a case of if anyone's listening that has something out with work that is very important to them, I personally have found that if I push myself a little bit too far in one direction just by getting my head down and cracking on with it myself, bringing somebody else in to do the thing that you were going to do anyway, but you get to have a chat along the way, has been something I found to be a really low-hanging fruit to make it much more enjoyable and much more fulfilling, whilst also simultaneously getting the task done.
This is a good segue, I think, at this point, Fergus, to talk about the biology stuff, because it actually connects to doing stuff with each other. So one reason, you talk to psychologists, they'll say men struggle with close friendships because we've got a bit of an intimacy problem, we've got a vulnerability problem. I explore a lot of this in the book. There's a lot of truth to it. As a kind of a simple shorthand of this conversation, what are the permissions between you and a friend or a group of friends? What's allowed to be said? Sometimes those permissions aren't very broad and you only have certain sorts of conversations or there's a certain sort of energy, and that can be really fun. And I'm not anti banter and fun and, you know, that kind of very like blokey, broy way of talking can be a right laugh. I'm not anti that, but it can sort of push out other stuff. That, in summary, is the masculinity pillar. The next one is that fundamentally the male social style is different to the female one. So we need to understand that if we're going to solve the problem, because we want to build these friendships in our image because they don't work the same way as female friendships. So I spoke, kind of the guru of this is a guy called Dr. Robin Dunbar. I've met him loads of times, interviewed him, got a whole chapter on his research in the book. Fascinating stuff. And he's studied primates and humans, and he says fundamentally male friendships are generally in groups. The model of male friendships is the club. They tend to be side by side, and it's based around doing stuff, so activities. Now, I really connected to that because I realised you lose the activity, you often lose the friendship. And generally, if you say to a bloke, you text them, go, do you want to come out tonight? They might be like, yeah, but what are we doing? They won't be like, yeah, I'd love a chat. They'd be like, sorry, why? Like, what's going on? But then female friendships tend to be face-to-face in dyads, so pairs rather than groups, based a lot more around talk and emotional disclosure. So they're much more personal, much more connected. So they are fundamentally different. But if you want to maintain male friendships, what happens as we get older? Often we have less time. So we lose these common activities or these spaces that used to exist at college, at school, in your early 20s. I mean, it's great you're replicating it in a lot of the stuff you do in terms of exercise and things, but we can lose these spaces. And that's when often the friendships drop off with it.
The spaces is a really key thing to focus on, really, because one of the biggest takeaways I learned from Gaz Bamford, former Sergeant Major of the Special Boat Service, he was episode number 2 on the podcast, I believe, and is a leadership consultant now. He talks a lot about the concept of the third space, which I know is something you speak about as well.
Yeah.
And he works with SLT, C-suite individuals that struggle to manage their existence outside of work, often have family, often have kids, and they just can't create those boundaries because their life exists at home, which is also a workplace, when they're getting the doomsday call at 3 a.m. because something's happened overseas that they need to get to, and then they're in the office, and there's no real in between. So creating a third space which is free of both of those stresses creates almost a safe haven in many ways. And if that can then be married up with social interaction, the sort of dosage of the other end of the spectrum that comes with that is enormous, isn't it? So from your perspective, how important is that third space in this setting?
It's massive. So, I mean, I said like the kind of broader societal cultural stuff interacts with it. So third spaces it's got this kind of idea comes from a sociologist called Ray Oldenburg. And it's exactly as you've said. We've got first space is work, third space is home. In between, places like used to be church, pubs, cafes, parks, social clubs. There used to be a big working men's club structure across the UK, similarly in the US. There used to be loads of these spaces, loads of this social infrastructure, and gradually it's kind of disappearing. So the scaffolding on which a lot of our relationships were built in previous decades have gone. Now that puts a lot of pressure on us as individuals to take control of that and build our own, or to carve out our own. And we're not socialized to put this work in as blokes. Like, we don't really think about it. So you get a bit older and you're like, what do you actually do? Where do people meet people? What do people do? Right? Because we never used to have to think about it. For the analogy I draw, so I kind of thought of this the other day, is it used to be very easy to stay fit and live and thin because movement was built into life. Think about, 60s, 70s, or pre-cars. You're just moving all the time. Now we've got a sedentary lifestyle. If you want to not be fat, or if you want to be fit, you've got to deliberately go, I'm in the gym three times a week, 4 times a week. You have to think about it. But you're a machine, Fergus. You're a beast. You're very dedicated to your training. But how many times, if you're listening to this, have you missed a gym session because you're like, I can't be asked, or I'm too busy? But same with the social world. Socializing now feels like it's like getting a 6-pack. I've got to put a shift in. So if you're not kind of trained to do it, or if you're just busy and you're knackered and you've got kids, like you say, you've got a busy job, suddenly it's much harder. So that's how, like, the male social style and this social change, it interacts and it exaggerates one another, and then we get in this complete pickle.
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because you're applying discipline and structures and parameters to what should be a really human process.
Yeah.
And by making it dogmatic and really being the architecture of your own social life, it makes it difficult to see it as social. It makes it seem like a chore. It makes it seem like something that needs ticked, which means that it's easy to say, I'm too busy, I'll sack it off. Because the spontaneity of social interaction that we had in late teens, early 20s is lost. And that's actually where I think back to some of the most joyous, hilarious moments of my life come from that spontaneous decision making. But life goes on, life moves on, and that you lose that. So how is that something you've ever wrestled with? Is that something you've confronted? Is it something you've spoken to people about in terms of trying to be an architect of your social life?
Yeah.
But processing the fact that in itself can become quite diminutive of the actual social interaction that comes at the back end.
Yeah.
Because it just makes it another human process, doesn't it?
I mean, it's an interesting question. Does the lack of spontaneity make it less valuable, less fun? Maybe an analogy is like if you're in a marriage, like, without being too crass, like in long-term marriages, especially people who've got kids, if they want to have sex, they have to schedule it. And everyone goes, it's so unromantic. But if you don't do that, you never bang. Right? So I think early in this process, I was like, friendships are organic, right? They should just happen if they're right. But you can't rely on the same templates as when you're teenager, early 20s. You've got to take initiative. I think it's a management problem. And I know that sounds really cynical and not very romantic. But if you think of it like that, you can get much more organized. And I tell you what, you might have to think about organizing a meet-up with your mate in a month's time. But when the day rolls around, it feels pretty spontaneous because you look in your diary and going like, oh, I'm seeing Kev tonight. Great. And when you're there, after like a minute, you're into it. So I think you just have to let go of this spontaneity idea, unfortunately.
I think that'll be valuable for people to hear, because I've sort of learned that myself in the past couple of years. But I often find that I'm far more proactive than some of my friends that are more clung on to the spontaneity idea, just because essentially I'm quite anal about the way that I manage my diary, and it's probably a little bit more, it's probably a bit more intense than it needs to be, but that's just for my own mental processing. I know that as part of the toolbox to manage myself, I want clarity and to be able to plan ahead and things like that, and sort of know where I'm going to be. But it means that I often feel like I'm weird for trying to arrange things 6 weeks in advance and sort of really pin down very specific plans so far in advance with those that still view it as a bit more organic. So it's not necessarily a challenge, but it's just an observation I've seen in terms of, I do feel like there's a bit of an evolution that comes with that. And I think it just comes from sort of being hit and rejected over and over again that actually, without planning these things in, you're not going to see the person. And if you're not planning things in and you're not seeing the person, you start asking yourself, are they somebody I still want to be friends with? Are they still a friend?
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then it forces you to make the time. And that's where you can actually probably find the friends that will stick with you for a long period of time.
Mm. But if you're listening to this and you're thinking, this all sounds like you're overthinking it. I'm 23 and my friends, it's very easy to be spontaneous with my friends. I tell you, you get a bit older and everyone gets really busy and they start moving to different parts of the country. Or, I live in London, right? So I live in a suburb of London called Surbiton. I was thinking about this today. One of my best mates is a guy called Nick. He lives in Stratford. So Surbiton's southwest London. He's in East London. It would take me about an hour and a half to get to his front door. If we meet halfway, it takes about an hour, right? That's not going to happen spontaneously. Like I have to be deliberate. So one thing actually on this, I think is an important thing is on the structure is try and have recurring rituals so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So for me, I'm doing it this Sunday. I do fortnightly five-a-side football. I organise it. I book the pitch, invite people, get it all sorted, and we'll play. And then we'll probably go. There's a pub next by the pitch. We might have a drink. Might do the quiz, and we do that every fortnight. And I know it's there. So when I fall off the wagon, and I've got other stuff going on, I can't do full time in my diary. I'm doing my friendships all day, like anyone else, right? I know if I do fall off the wagon and I'm not disciplined with my social life, it's there. It looks after me. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, what can I do? I call it like the tent peg strategy. What tent pegs can you knock in? They're there. And then around it, the spontaneous stuff is great. One spontaneous thing a week and a tent peg thing a week or a fortnight, you kind of got there.
That's it, isn't it? It's having these structures in place so that you almost take the choice away, as with many habits and disciplines and things in the modern world. Is if you factor them in ahead of time and almost make it a non-negotiable by penciling it in formally, then you remove the spontaneous opportunity to not go, which is the real benefit that sits there. So we've covered the masculinity point, we've covered the biological point. There were compounding factors with society that you thought were worth mentioning as well. What are they?
Well, it's just there's a few things. One is this decline of third spaces. One is there is a lot more geographic mobility and all forms of mobility. So we swap jobs way more than we used to. And so your social network kind of disperses as you move jobs, especially if you're a bloke. So men generally, our social lives tend to revolve around the woman in our life if we're straight, or our job. So those two things, if they're swapping a lot, you're losing that. By the way, that's why married men are less lonely than unmarried men, because we kind of got that help in that front. But the kind of mobility point, a lot of people don't own homes anymore. They rent, and rents tend to be short, so they're swapping where they're living in cities, or they're moving to a completely different city. That mobility means that we don't build that social world. To think about what it used to be like. You used to be born in a place and you'd be there forever. And not only that, you'd have an extended family around you, and you'd be part of all these institutions locally, like your church or whatever. We don't have that scaffolding, we don't have that support, and we're not in the same place for long enough for this stuff to happen naturally. Another kind of thing that I think is under, and we kind of touched on it already, but is under mentioned, is time. Like if you look at the time use surveys, we're spending a lot more time with our spouse or our girlfriend because the role a marriage plays in a life is different now. People stand up at their wedding and go, my best friend's my wife, I'm marrying my best friend today. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that would be insane, right? So we're putting a lot of eggs in that basket, investing a lot more time in that. There are positives there, obviously, but sucks time out from other things. People parent now a lot more intensely. We're pouring a lot more time into our kids. And the leisure time we do have left, if you look at how people are spending their time, we're spending a lot more of that time alone. And we're taking that from our friendships. We are doing it on our device, on our phone. We're doing it with the TV. So these kind of broader structural factors are sucking time away and making the the time to see friends a lot more hard to carve out.
I think that that's non-gender specific as well, which is an important point to make because for any women listening, we've obviously
Yeah.
been very male centric here, but a lot of this, as with the charity stuff I've done over the years, I have "be a man of more words" tattooed on my bicep, but essentially "be a person of more words" goes a long way. But to focus back on men for a second, there's a study that came out, well, survey that came out in November recently, which was that 1 in 3 men believe they have zero close friends in the
Yeah.
modern world, which is a terrifying thought. And Johan Hari speaks about his book in Lost Connections about how essentially there's a survey in America where the number is ever increasing in terms of people. I think the average is now 0.51 in terms of 0.49. It's dropped below 0.5 where people will answer how many close friends they have. So for the first time ever, it's closer to zero than it is a single person. And that is a terrifying prospect that I reflect on a lot because, as I've said, I was fortunate enough to have access to friends when I needed them but chose not to access them, which is entirely my own doing and came from being naive and ignorant to the reality of the situation, which I've learned from and try and encourage others to do so now. But if we're increasing at this rate in the modern world, it's hard not to think about the future. So, from what you've learned and about equipping yourself and others with the toolbox they need to manage their mental health and better manage their relationships, what are the things that we can start doing tomorrow that will give us a better fighting chance to get that number moving back up?
Yeah. I mean, I've got loads of like tips here, and I'll just share them. For some of these are going to seem like so simple. You're like, are you being serious, mate? You're actually going to say that's a kind of a how-to point. But I think the simple ones that on reflection I wasn't even doing, right? So, for example, show up. If you're invited to something, show up. Don't ignore the WhatsApp. Don't drop out at the last minute. Don't go, oh God, the trains are a bit crap today. I'm done. You got to show up. Friendship is got a rhythm. When you're in the rhythm, it's like reciprocated and we're going to and fro. It doesn't feel like a big deal to socialize. It's like a steady drumbeat. You lose the rhythm, you got to get back into it, show up. Secondly, go first. Kind of on the Sherpa point I mentioned earlier, be the one who steps forward and shows a bit of leadership. I tell you what, it's like an aphrodisiac, a social aphrodisiac to men. Men love the organising stuff because they probably haven't done it. They're like, oh, it's giving me the horn. Yeah, let's go. I want to go bowling. All right, I haven't been for years. Let's do it. Own it, so take responsibility, don't outsource it. Set yourself up for consistency, that ritual point. Expand your toolbox. So I really like this point because sometimes when you talk about the masculinity stuff and about vulnerability, men's eyes glaze over and they've read lots of articles in broadsheets about everyone telling them to be vulnerable and how they're toxic, and they go, I can't listen to this again. There's a guy I spoke to, a guy called Fred Rabinovitz. He runs a lot of men's groups in the US. He's a psychologist as well as a university professor. And he says he just talks about expanding your toolbox. Sometimes stoicism, like grinning and bearing it, that's really useful in some contexts. I don't want to work with someone who bloody moans all the time. Sometimes I want you to strap on a smile and get on with it. Nothing wrong with that. But that is not an appropriate tool for every conversation. So what other tools have you got in your box in conversations? I would always make things very intellectual or try and be funny. Those were the two tools I had. That meant that I couldn't actually get close friendships with people. How can you expand your toolbox a little bit? In terms of how you do it, you can just start really small and then raise the stakes. So it might be by, rather than someone says, how are you? Don't talk about how something brilliant that's just happened. You can talk about that and then go, but I'm worried that I'm just not getting on with my girlfriend. I just think I got a feeling she's just not into it. Like, start with something small, and then you can raise the stakes. You can make it bigger. You can go into a much bigger subject. I mean, that's a pretty big one to start with, but you get my point. If it's scary, you don't have to go full Brené Brown. All right, you can take it slow. Another one, I call it say the L word, which is I like you. Now, men often don't communicate affection at all. I spoke to a guy and he said, I've never felt like my best friend's best friend. And I was like, I know what you mean. Like, I, sometimes we can be know someone for like 20 years and like, does this dude? I mean, I got no idea he's into this at all, but we see each other regularly.
I
It
feel,
really,
yeah, yeah, I feel strangely attacked because I know exactly what you mean. Even though the sentence, you laugh at the sentence, you're like, "What a ridiculous sentence!" Oh, hang on.
yeah.
Yeah, that hurts. I get it. I get it. Yeah, yeah.
um, and then maybe end on this one. Help yourself be lucky. We like to think that we don't have much control often of our social life, and we kind of touch on this idea it should be spontaneous and it just kind of happens. And a lot of our life when we were younger, that's what went on, right? But help yourself be lucky. Generally, it's not rocket science. We tend to hang out with people or become friends with people, I should say, who are like us, basically, and we come into contact with quite a lot. So, where are those spaces you can put yourself in where those collisions are going to happen that are fairly consistent? And over time, you'll just end up being friends. You won't even have to think about it. It's not like the cheesy, I'm going to make a friend today. It's putting yourself in those places. So, for me, as kind of a tangible example, if you're listening to this, CrossFit gym. I'm not a massive athlete. I kind of do my best. I do it as a hobby, and I'm fine with that. But this gym, I've ended up. It's called Motion.
Yeah, I know
And
the owners. I know the owners at Motion. Yeah,
I do. They're great. They're very nice, and they do a great job. Um, you know them. Who knew?
yeah. There you go. It's a small world, but it's a fantastic point because if you just spend time around
Yeah.
people that are interested in the same things, you'll accidentally make friends, won't you?
So there's this big WhatsApp group with Motion, but there's a spin-off WhatsApp group. So if you're listening to this in Motion and you're not in it, we can add you. But it's for all the people in Motion Gym who don't really love being fit, who maybe probably drink too much, probably eat badly. It's called Slow Motion, and it's just those 12 blokes. But
Love
I'm
it.
part of
Very good.
that, and we meet up through that. We will go out for a curry and things. But I haven't moved to Surbiton where I live and gone, I will make friends. I've gone, well, I don't want to be, it feels a bit intense. I'm going to put myself in a place where it just kind of happens. So where basically ask yourself this: what are you into? What do you want to learn? What are you interested in? What have you been meaning to try for ages? Or take a random stab at something on Groupon and go, I'm going to try that. Just if you're living an interesting life and you're doing things that excite you, generally it will happen. So come at it through like a side door. That's probably my biggest tip.
No, they're all fantastic things to better equip the toolbox, and I think just to touch on the vulnerability narrative and the stoic narrative is this is what I've found. I did a video on masculinity on YouTube recently, which I knew was going to be tough reading in the comments. But for the most part, the first 90% was really solid, and then we got some degenerates trickle through. But nonetheless, if you're listening, you are a moron. If you're if you're not listening, I'll address some of the concerns here. But essentially, what I saw a lot of was really binary thinking, which was stoicism will cure this, doing this will cure this, thinking this way will make this better. And it's well, no, all of these value systems and belief systems give you a different perspective which will stack over time and therefore gives you the ability to sort of switch between what's required dependent on the context of the situation. Great example, whenever I've done ultra endurance events, 40 hours was the sort of biggest one most recently over 2 days, a 2-day triathlon in Snowdonia. And there were times where I had to just get my head down and grin and bear it. There were times where I had to complain and add humour. There were times where I said things that probably were incriminating if caught on camera, but that's because that was my coping mechanism at the time. There were times where I didn't want any social interaction. I just wanted to get my head down, be given something so I could keep moving forwards and not worry about anything else. There were times where I felt exceptionally lonely in the dark, and just knowing that there was a car with people behind me carrying all my stuff made me feel much better. And that's why these events for me are a real microcosm of sort of myself. I'm almost magnifying myself temporarily, because as the tiredness sets in, the fatigue sets in, I'm forced to confront on what am I missing here? How do I feel? How am I responding to it? I am vulnerable right now. How am I responding? Right, how can you do better at this next time? And I do genuinely feel like I can translate all of those lessons learned into my day-to-day existence, where I feel a spike in emotion when somebody sends an email, or when I see a comment on YouTube saying, this guy's a pussy because he's talking about this, that, or the other, which happens a lot, which makes me laugh because it's so difficult to conceptualize that sort of limited worldview, knowing what I now know and having gone through that process. But it means that I'm much more confident in taking risks. I'm much more confident in, for example, There's a David Lloyd opening just down the road, which I am so excited about because it's a hub. And even from a practical point of view, swimming for me is a nightmare. I need to go into Edinburgh, which is 30 minutes drive away on a good day, just for a swim, which can be a pain in the arse if I'm not in Edinburgh that day. But they've got paddle courts.
Oh, I've been trying to find those, you know.
Yeah, they're hot real estate these days.
Yeah.
It's just this phenomenon that's blown up, and I can't wait to. I don't know whether I'll buy my own racket, whether I rent a racket, but I'm going to be there on day one, just tip tapping a ball, waiting for somebody to pop up and join in, because I know it's just a sort of it's acting like a child. It's kicking a ball around the playground and sort of laughing at your mates as you do it, and just knowing that anyone that's going there and using that as a hub, like I will be, there'll be crossover. We'll have things in common, however in depth or otherwise they are. There'll be enough there to sort of explore that individual, and whether they become a friend or not, it doesn't really matter. And I've found actually that just by putting myself into situations where I'm confident there'll be like-minded people is enough for me to take the risk towards it now, which has been massively valuable for me personally in the past 6 months.
Yeah.
It sounds very similar to you. Just, well, I need a community. I need to also train. CrossFit, Surbiton, what's there? Motion, cool, off we go. And here you are in a little subsection group called Slow Motion. Very good, by the way. Huge fan of that. Nailing curries and talking about the people that are there just for the fitness, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think maybe something we should touch on just off the back of that is there might be people watching or listening to this and going, it feels pretty scary to do that though, because I have become pretty disconnected, and I wouldn't. What the kind of the slightly bizarre thing about loneliness is that it's like a signal our body sends is to try and it's like a internal pain to go and find people, because if you imagine we're on the African savannah 2,000 years ago, it's like you've lost your tribe, you're going to get picked off by a tiger or whatever, you got to go and find the gang. So that's why we have it, and we become hyper vigilant, because if you can imagine us on that savannah, we're going, what's going on? We become very hyper vigilant. But oddly, what that does in the modern world, that hyper vigilance, is we start misinterpreting social cues, and we start preemptively judging social situations we're about to be in. We start going, that will be really dangerous and scary, or they won't like me, I'm boring, they'll be rude about me behind my back, it'll be mean, it'll be super awkward. Our loneliness is making us misjudge it. So if you are kind of quite disconnected and you're feeling that this is intense, I just think a useful thing to bear in mind is that hypervigilance is not real. It's like something that we've evolved to have, and it's just something you might want to overcorrect for that.
It's exactly how I felt when I was at my worst. And actually what got me out the other side was having Odie, my dog, who was 14 weeks old at the time. Essentially a French Bulldog puppy was a big solution for me. It's not the solution I recommend. Very expensive, fart a lot, always in the vets. Instagram doesn't tell you that. And what he got me doing was essentially being outside more, having more of a routine. And in doing so, I was just having simple conversations with people in Newcastle at the time. Oh, my hairdresser's got one of these. Aren't they funny? Yes, they are. Oh, that was a human exchange. Yeah. And then another, and then another. And that stacked over the time to where I was sitting in a coffee shop. And I started getting to know people in there, and I knew them by name. And then they'd look after Odie whilst I did an hour's work. And then that built and built and built. And before I knew it, I was like, oh, I feel like myself again. And all it was one step out of the door and stumbling into a conversation with another human being. And that was massively rewarding for me. And it really circles back to what I always try and focus on, which is one step forwards rather than one leap off a cliff and hope for the best. Because I think so many people, when they feel lonely, try and look too far in the future rather than just taking one tiny step forwards the next day and another the next and another the next. And before you know it, your life will be unrecognizable.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult place to be in. And I don't want to sound in any way naive or ignorant, because I've been there myself, but I have such faith in the power of one positive forward step with intent can make a massive, massive difference, which is why be a man of more words is so important to me, because words are easy, words are simple. It doesn't need to be complex, it just needs to be more of them. So with that in mind, I want to say thank you very much for a conversation that's been somewhat cathartic for me in many ways. It's helped me understand a lot of things I've been wrestling with myself recently, but also a topic that requires a lot of attention. So if anyone wants to check out your published works or where you are most available on the internet, where is the best place to direct them?
So I've got a book out, of course, Billy No Mates, How I Realised Men Have a Friendship Problem. It's like a funny memoir, so I don't know if you could tell that from this conversation. There's a load of jokes in this book, but all the research, spell it out through my personal story as well. It's gone really well. It's also an audiobook. I read the audiobook, so if you like this, there's more of that in the audiobook, ebook.
The jokes are delivered well from your comedic background, which is something that probably worth mentioning, which is why you know Edinburgh so well.
Yeah,
you're not going to be at the Fringe this year, which
I'm
everybody
not the
will
Fringe.
moan in disappointment at right now.
But if you want to know more, I'm on Twitter at Max Dickins. I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, you'd be amazed how many people are on LinkedIn. It's like
it's a dangerous place these days, isn't it?
Yeah, there's some proper tossers on LinkedIn. It's hilarious, but it's also it's not as saturated or as vain as some of the others. So it's kind of, sometimes the conversations are good. But anyway, wherever you are, come and say hello. I always love hearing from people.
Fantastic. Really enjoyed that, and have a good evening.
Thanks, mate.